issues in moral philosophy. So it's a more academic or theoretical dimension to the lecture. The second quarter is concerning applying the stuff we talked about to debating and the techniques involved in doing so. The third quarter is in addressing some of the Q&As that I got from folks, both offline, online, and also, of course, if you guys have questions, you can ask through Zoom and other channels such as the YouTube form. But that's effectively the format of the session today. And before I start, just again, an apology for the delay, an apology for the Wi-Fi interruptions. So let's just start off with, I think, a more theoretical overview of moral philosophy, because the first caveat to note is that there's no way I can give you an exhaustive overview or survey of all the issues there are to talk about in moral philosophy. And the reasonings are a couple. The first is just that moral philosophy often involves a multiplicity of spheres, of intersecting subjects. And there are times when you think of, you think that you've exhausted all possible fields of inquiry in a field, and then a new topic like, say, nascent technology, surveillance technology, social media, digital media crop up. And there's always the opportunity and always an opening for you to find new angles to analyze. There's no way that the following survey is going to exhaustively cover all the possible themes, horizontally speaking, concerning moral philosophy. The second observation is the vertical observation, that there's no exact way by which I can survey all of the possible arguments, rejoinders, objections, and also counter objections within a field, simply because at the end of the day, moral philosophy, much as debating, is an evolving field. It evolves when you look at the way arguments and dialectics have played out until the final form, or the most penultimate form, until you get your hands onto them, right? And then that's when you can transform and change and shift the frontiers of argumentation within a field. This all sounds a bit abstract, but I think it's just to highlight the fact that there's no absolute right or wrong. There's no definitive, absolute consensus that is unshakable. There's only, trivially speaking, consensus over certain topics, because it just so happens that mainstream opinions or mainstream moral discourses have converged towards particular points over the past few centuries or decades. So for instance, the view that it is wrong to kill an innocent human being, this was not necessarily the norm or accepted to be the norm until quite recently, in moral philosophization, where it was observed in the early 16th century that all lives are in fact equal by a rise of civic humanists in a post-Renaissance world. But even then, in Western traditional intellectual history, it took another 200 and 300 years until John Stuart Mill stood up and said, hey, folks, actually, we should think of women as having and bearing rights in their own rights as well. And as you can tell, therefore, the evolution of political thought and the way political thought is transformed and changes throughout decades and centuries is something that's quite contingent. It's a makeshift product of their times, or the specific times by which individuals partaken and participating. So enough with the abstract and long-winded rant. Let's get into the meat. So first sub-issue under the topic of theory is, what are the common issues in moral philosophy that I think we should all have at least a cursory, if not a perfunctory, understanding of as debaters? So I'm going to outline, just copy and paste them because I've typed them up. I think they're broadly, wait, let's paste that to everyone can see it. There are broadly four issues I want to touch upon in terms of moral philosophy, and that is the following. Firstly, the non-identity problem. And what exactly is a non-identity problem? The second issue is consequentialism and the case against it. The third, and rather similar really, issue is utilitarianism, which is a particular variant of consequentialism. And then finally, moral responsibility and this question of free will. I'm going to subsume issue 4 under issue 2 and talk about them one by one, really, and outlining what the problems and issues are at stake, how they might be pertinent to debate, and finally, what the possible solutions are to them. So to start us off with, I want to talk about the non-identity problem. And this is a pet favorite topic of mine and something that I've written rather, well, not extensively, but I've written on in the past. And what exactly is a non-identity problem? Well, here's a hypothetical example. Suppose I come up to you, Anna, and you're called Bob, and I say, Bob, you're the governor of this state, right? You're the governor of the state. You have the ability to decide upon certain policies that affect future generations. Bob, I reckon you shouldn't pollute You shouldn't pollute today because your pollution today would effectively cause generations in, say, 80 years or 90 years' time to be born with genetic diseases as a result of the pollution, as a result of the pollutants entering the bodies of their parents or the grandparents. So you're really harming these children here with your decision to pollute the river, Bob. As the governor, you ought to prohibit such pollution and also withdraw any and all acts that support such abhorrent behaviors. So I say that to Bob. And Bob says, well, Brian, you are obviously a civic humanist or whatever you'd like to call yourself. I don't know, pragmatic idealist, or to some extent a jaded idealist, and indeed someone with no principles, whatever. And Brian, if you think about it, right? If I don't pollute, if I don't sign off yes to the polluting orders, what's going to happen to these folks in the future? Well, if I change the date and time by which I signed the pollution order, or indeed if I chose not to sign it at all, that means that we might be altering the circumstances and the events that happen in the world around us. That means that, when future generations or future folks meet and become couples and potentially produce offspring, the time at which they do that is completely different because of, as we know it, the butterfly effect, right? That my initial decision to not cause pollution would inadvertently result in many of these future generations or future folks having a different moment or a different moment when they meet, when they become couples, and when they have children. That means that the identities of the very children and also offspring that are produced is changed, right? It's altered by the very fact that I've shifted certain circumstances and certain facts about the world around us, such that different combinations of eggs and sperms produce different individuals. Now, for all of you listening to me right now, you must think I'm absolutely bonkers, but trust me, decades of philosophy and philosophical literature have been written on this subject with a very precise argument that exactly because of A, the butterfly effect, and B, that our existence and our identities are fragile, that they might change or be altered as a result of just the narrowest changes or the narrowest alterations to the circumstances of our birth, that effectively means that with this policy decision to not pollute, an entirely different generation of people would exist in 80 years' time. So the original generation of folks that we were talking about that were allegedly harmed by our decisions to pollute, at least on an intuition level, the comparative for them, had Bob, the governor, not signed off on pollution, would be that they do not exist. And if that's indeed the case, and it seems all the more, and assuming that their existence is at least net positive, it seems all the more weird to think that we should stop polluting, because in doing so, we're stifling an entire generation of individual from being born. We're preventing their births in the first place. Now here, I'd like to take the opportunity, if there's the option to do so, to set up a poll. I'd like to do an informal straw poll, at least of the 12 folks that are currently online. I'd just like to ask, if you're Bob the governor, do you reckon that the moral course of action for you is to A, to continue polluting, or B, to stop polluting? Now, let's do a bit of a straw poll. So for those of you who reckon that continuing polluting such that the generation that we were talking about saving can at least be born, that's the moral course of action. For those of you who think so, can you raise your hands? Oh, you can't raise your hands. I'm sorry. I think apparently that's not it is an option. You can click raise hand. Okay. So there are 2 B's so far. Sorry, Ajwa, can you comment B, and spectator, can you say B to everyone, not me, just so everyone else can see it? Right. So this is a bit strange, right? Because all of you seem to be in favor then of killing an entire generation, of depriving the existence of an entire generation of future persons. Why is that justified? Well, this is where the non-identity problem kicks in that folks that talk about non-identity problem are realistically talking about a trilemma. The trilemma constitutes the following 3 propositions that collectively are mutually incompatible. So assuming and granting the veracity of the claim that our existences are fragile and that had certain preceding events prior to our births occurred differently and indeed occurred differently, right? Then if that were indeed the case, then the very identities of those that emerge from these events would also be different. That's the premise that we assume to be true. Then there are 3 possible, what is going on. Then there are three possible propositions that cannot collectively be all true concurrently. And these are the propositions. The first proposition is that, firstly, the intuition, e.g., in the case of Bob the governor, wait, why is it not allowing me to type? That there's something wrong with our choosing, or indeed the governor choosing option A. That's the first proposition. The second proposition is that when we're talking about wrongness, wrongness is necessarily a person-affecting concept. So when we say that something is wrong, like to kill is wrong, we're only saying that it is wrong because it affects certain people in a particular manner, in a way that very well might be unpleasant, in a way that very well might wrong them in that sense. And a corollary of that, under the same proposition, or following the lines of that very proposition, is that if you harm someone, you therefore wrong them. Or alternatively, you wrong someone by harming them. Why do I say, or why is this premise important? It's important because fundamentally, this provides a link or connection between a negative state of affairs, i.e. the inducing of harm upon someone, or the bringing about a negative state of affairs upon someone, and the idea that you're harming, that you're wronging that very individual. So the connection between harming and wronging is salient here, because as we can tell from the third premise, the claim there is quite simple, that existence is a net positive experience and therefore does not harm the individual in question. So these are three competing intuitions, and collectively they become a trilemma, they become a paradox, because if we grant that there's something wrong in the case of Bob the governor and pollution, and if we grant that wrongness necessarily is a person-affecting concept, then the only way in which this is coherent is if we believe that the existence of these individuals born in future or born in the future are net utility negative, or that it is a net negative experience. That, in other words, their lives are not worth having instead of worth being had. But alternatively, we buy that existence is a net positive experience and that there's something wrong, however, with the cases like Bob the governor and all that, then we must believe that wrongness is not a person-affecting concept, or that at the very least the moral uneasiness that we have amongst the intuitions is not something that has to do with the impact on particular persons. But finally, if we accept that wrongness is necessarily person-affecting, and that fundamentally existence is a net positive experience, and therefore, given that it is net positive, that therefore there's no harm and ergo there's no wronging, then we must reject the first claim, that intuitively there's something wrong about what's going on in these non-identity cases like Bob the governor. Now, these propositions collectively are known as a trilemma because you can only accept 2 out of 3 of them maximally. So they're not compossible. You can't put all of them and accept all of them and endorse all of them concurrently. So how do philosophers then try to resolve this? Because in order for the non-identity problem, or the problem that I talked about just then, to be resolved, either you deny one or you deny more amongst these propositions, or you explain why these 3 are not in fact trilemmas, are not in fact mutually incompatible claims. So here I'm just going to outline very quickly a possible solution that has useful implications and has its uses for debating at large. And this is what we call a rights-based argument. So the rights-based argument seeks to dispel premise 2 star. The rights-based argument says you can wrong someone without harming them. And I will answer wrongness affecting animals under my discussion concerning animal rights in section 2. So no worries, I'll just add that very quickly to my doc, i.e. Can animals be wronged? Cool. Yeah, great. So thank you for that question. That's a really interesting question, and I have a lot of thoughts on that. But very quickly, though, the claim here is that you can fundamentally wrong someone without harming them. And the underlying logic is you can violate the rights without harming an individual overall. So let me give you an example. Suppose that I walk up to a dear friend, a patient of mine, a dear friend of mine, a relative, and say, your body check has come back entirely net positive. You're very much healthy. You're fine. But in reality, my friend is dying from cancer. And I know, and this might indeed be the case, objectively the case, that had I told them and informed them of their cancer status, they would have led a very, very, miserable life for the remainder of the life, which, frankly speaking, wouldn't be that long. And assuming here that it is terminal, assuming further that my friend is indeed rendered better off in terms of their welfare as a result of my actions, I've therefore not harmed them by lying to them. If anything, I've benefited them. I've helped them, right? I've fundamentally ensured that their preferences, their well-being and all that are maximized, at least given the constraints we have that we're operating under. By the way, sorry for the background noise. Someone's fixing the plumbing in the background. I swear it's not because I am currently cooking. That is not the case. I don't know how to cook. So, given that is indeed the case, I've not harmed that individual. However, observers might say I've wronged that very individual. And the reason for that is because that person or my friend has the right to not be lied to. Let me type that. Right to not be lied to, right? And that's important because precisely because there's a pre-existing right to not be deceived and that right has been contravened, that is where the uneasiness or perhaps the intuitions that my friend has been wronged by me, that's where it comes from. Now, if we apply this back to the case of non-identity problem, the intuitive rejoinder is to say, well, folks born in 8 decades time, in 80 years time, they have a right. They have a right to be born, to live above, say, sufficiently comfortable or minimally comfortable lives. And to be born with genetic diseases of that sort that afflict them with perennial, even if it's low intensity, but still perennial pain, is indeed a reason why their lives might not be above that sufficient minimum, might not be a decent life overall. So the rejoinder then launched by people like, say, Woodward. I think it's Jeremy Woodward, but I've forgotten his first name. Doesn't really matter. Woodward, 1986, argues that the rejoinder to the non-identity problem lies with rights. One of them might be the right to lead a minimum or sufficiently decent life. And this is also something that Tassiolis talks about when he discusses human rights and what constitutes a decent life / nickel. But the thing is, and here's the main pushback against what Woodward says. Right, you claim, Woodward, that there's a right on the part of the individual in 80 years' time to lead minimally decent lives. But ultimately, what really makes a right meaningful is if you can waive it, right? Is if you, as the individual that holds the right, can say, I don't like the right, I don't care for the right, or it's less important than other concerns and competing considerations. And indeed, if we apply this back to the case of lying to your friend, right? Your friend might say, actually, Sam or Brian, I really would have rather that you hadn't told me of the fact that I had cancer. I'd really prefer that you lied to me. So there's always room for waiving the rights. And there's always a room for basically saying, I forego this right in exchange for greater instrumental benefits or consequentialist gains that I might have. And therefore, what Derek Parfit says is that individuals in the positions of those generations born in the future would say, I'd much rather waive my right than not to exist at all. And he bets that basically if you did a hypothetical survey of folks born in the future, they'd say, I'd very much prefer a world where I was existent and lead these pretty bad lives, but nevertheless still net positive lives, than a world where I did not exist. Ergo, the rights analysis and argument doesn't tackle the non-identity problem sufficiently. Now, what are the rejoinders that rights-based accounts have adopted towards Parfit then? And some of them are indeed what I've been working on in part of my research. We don't have much time to go into too much detail concerning this because I genuinely think we need to get onto the other 9 parts of my lecture. But some of the responses are, A, you can regret the very fact or the very necessity of your existence being bound up with these terrible conditions. B, you can also regret in a manner that does not mean or does not express the fact that you would have preferred a comparative world to this particular world. Just because you regret something doesn't mean that you prefer the comparative, right? So this is, again, very undebatory, but I think an interesting dimension here is ask yourselves in regrets debates, must we necessarily embrace a counterfactual specific interpretation of what regrets debates seem to at the moment, at least by colloquial convention, entail or require us to do or prove. Now, in meta debating terms, I don't necessarily think that the only reason or only way to run debate about regret sufficiently or successfully is to force teams to look at comparatives. I think you can win arguments in THR debates without invoking counterfactuals, without explaining what a counterfactual is better. But by convention and by the way that debating has evolved since, I don't know, 2016, it's seemingly become the case in order to win on prop in THR debates, you have to prove why the counterfactual is better. Now, that's something that I, pun intended, on a macro scale or meta scale, regret. But unfortunately, that seems to be how the game is now played or now won. So I have a question coming in. Does not choosing B mean that you harm the hypothetical? Right, good point, John. So that's indeed Derek Parfit's claim. He says that given that if you'd chosen to not bring about, say, this generation of folks, you're then bringing about the existence of another generation, right? The generation that would be born because you don't have pollution, then clearly it seems that it is a bit futile to talk about who would have come into the picture. What's more constructive here is to compare the net well-being and welfare of these two separate potential generations, generation in world A and generation in world B. I'm going to get onto that in just a sec, but very quickly back on the rights-based solutions. Other possible responses is to say there might be possible worlds where both the harm could have been avoided and also the future generations could have existed, thereby denying the very underlying metaphysical premise concerning or underlying the non-identity problem. That's another approach, another rejoinder that we have seen adopted in the past. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but final question here is, did only the affected stakeholder have the right to waive the rights? Very good point. So here's the thing. I think in debate land, we often assume that the only persons that can possibly waive your own rights must be the individual, right? Because you say, you're violating the autonomy and violating the consent and also the autonomous wills of these agents, and therefore you've done something wrong. But in moral convention and also day-to-day common sense intuitions, we don't really think like that, right? We allow parents to make decisions for the children. We allow teachers to decide the curricular contents for their own students. We allow the government to set up laws that, 16-year-olds or 18-year-olds may not necessarily have A, the ability to reject and, deny, and B, may not even have the ability to comprehend and understand. So whilst autonomy is often priced at a very high premium in debate land, in practice, there are obviously instances where other folks intervene on behalf of certain right holders and waive rights on their part. But personally, from my own perspective, and this is Brian Wong's perspective, not like as a moral philosopher in general at large perspective, from my perspective, we have to be skeptical. We have to be skeptical of cases in which such paternalism is warranted, because for far too long, the state has employed and also structures of power have employed the claim that this is good for you, and therefore, I can waive your rights on behalf of you, or I can choose not to waive your rights on behalf of you. This paternalistic mentality has been exploited for far too long by people in positions of power to justify horrendous interventionism and justify horrendous paternalistic interferences with people's lives. So the extent to which we are, permitting others to interfere with our lives and waive our rights on our behalf must be correlated with the extent to which these folks have an accurate and reasonable grasp of our interests and needs. And this is indeed something that is brought up by Bates when Bates is trying to talk about the idea of the extent to which paternalistic international interventions are or are not justified, indeed, on a geopolitical level. But I digress. So that is an example, the non-identity problem and the discussion surrounding it is an example of where moral philosophy, I think, has often been traditionally overlooked in mainstream discourse, but I think is really interesting. And that's why I spent 29 minutes talking about this particular topic. But I do want to move on because I realize I'm spending too much time here and that's not particularly useful. The second topic I'd like to chat about, and very quickly because we don't have that much time, is on moral responsibility and the question of free will. And I promise you that after this section, I'll move on to applying this to debates and also debate techniques. So basically, the debate about free will is quite straightforward. The reality is, or at least I think one version of reality is, rather, not necessarily a correct version, or the way I see it at very least, is the world around us is determined and constitutive in a range of rules and a range of systems that are themselves underpinned by rules. So this sounds a bit abstract, but if you think about it, you chose today to listen to Brian Wong's lecture, or I hope you chose to, you were not forced to, or else I'd feel very embarrassed. You chose to listen to me. And you think, you chose it because you as X made this autonomous choice. But if you think deeper about it, or more deeply about it, the reason why you chose as such is because you've done debating for a while, or you're quite interested in debating, and it just so happened that you saw this advert on your Facebook saying, Astana Euros, come click in, let's talk about moral philosophy. And then if you take a step back, why exactly can you see Astana Euros post on your Facebook? It's because you liked it. You liked the page. Why did you like it? Well, it's because you do a lot of debating, or you do quite a fair bit of debating, and you're quite interested in improving yourselves. But why did you do debating? Maybe it's because you wanted to improve your public speaking skills. Maybe it's because you got dragged into it by someone that happens to sit next to you, opposite you at university or in your classroom. Maybe it's because you saw an advert the other day talking about debating and public speaking, how potent it is, and that caused you to develop the volition, the preference that you want to do debating. And then take a step back. Why exactly did he come across these billboards telling you to do debating? Or the friend that did a lot of debating and is coming back for the 10th tournament, the 10th Worlds. Actually, no, that's constitutionally barred. 10th Euros, right? It's because of events that are quite technically beyond your control. Your upbringing, your education, your pedagogical background, your biological circumstances, your chemical intake, what you eat, and all of that are factors that are beyond your control, but nevertheless that drive and propel and shape your choices. And then if you take a step back, because you might say, but surely it's still me, right? I've grown up as such. I am someone that is capable of developing my own preferences and even my second order preferences about what preferences to have and all of that. And therefore, surely I'm autonomous. But if you then take a grand step back, the family into which you're born, the education that you receive, the cultural ideas that are ingrained into you during your childhood, all of these are beyond your control. And indeed, even if you strip away the extent to which your beliefs are social culturally determined by your context, by your own experiences, by your own lives, the very metaphysical bare bones and the skeleton of the world about us constitutes one where there is predetermination, where because of prior causes and prior events, our realities are predetermined for what went on before us. Now, I don't want to dictate or stipulate that determinism is just true. There are obvious objections to it. I'm going to outline a few possible texts that you might want to read in order to challenge determinism, or that do some ample and interesting damage to determinism. And determinism, by determinism, I mean the view that effectively, causally speaking, metaphysically speaking, events that occur in the future are fixed by what have gone on in the past through either direct causation or indirect correlation and association. Now, there are some challenges to determinism that I think would be useful to raise, and I'm just going to add or throw in a link or two into the the Zoom chat. So, okay, Kane has written a fair amount on this. Actually, why don't I just copy and paste the most useful intro article, which is free will. There we go. Okay. So the Stanford Encyclopedia really is, in my opinion, one of the best intro pieces or intro options for accessing material concerning moral philosophy and ethics at large. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But the long and short is, if we grant that determinism is true, should we therefore believe in free will still? Or rather, is there really a justification for us to say, I'm going to hold you, Sam, or Bob, or Kendi, responsible for what occurs as a result of your own actions? Because it's not just, the fact that some folks commit crimes because allegedly that's the result or product of circumstances. It's not just about sociological determinism and talking about metaphysical determinism, that everything we do, that however we act, the preferences and choices we make are all shaped by factors beyond our control. And if that's indeed the case, if that's indeed true, then it strikes us that we have an explanatory gap here, because the very practice of holding others responsible, or at the very least, the very reason why in layman terms we hold people responsible, seems to be that we think they caused it. A criminal should be held liable for the crime they committed because they caused it. They intended for it to happen. They brought it about. It was their agency, and they were of sound mind, or rather, they were of a relatively sound mind and a mental state, and therefore should be held accountable for their own actions. So the free will problem arises as such as a result of the incompatibility, or the purported incompatibility, between premise 1, metaphysical determinism, and premise 2, the normative need or desire for some practice of holding individuals responsible. The ability on our part to reconcile these two premises determines if we can answer the question or the problem of free will. A solution to the problem of free will should explain why these two facts or these two premises are either compatible, or at the very least, or rather, or alternatively, deny or reject either one of these premises. So some folks think that premise 1 is false, and the broad lines of attack really there are to say that there's a difference between what some people call transient causes and, oh God, what is going on? Transient causes. Yep, so this comes from Chisholm. A transient causation and an immanent causation. So for him, he thinks that, if an event causes another event, then we don't have agency. But if it's an agent causing another event, then we have agency because we cause it. But some accuse Chisholm of begging the question, of basically asserting and assuming that responsibility and moral responsibility exists in the first place in order for this sort of ascription-based model or practice-based model to work. So most folks aren't necessarily a fan of adopting premise 1. So premise 1 often tends to be accepted. And then some folks, I guess, are normative skeptics. They say in response to premise 2, oh, look, folks, we should abandon all talk or discussion of moral responsibility. We should not think that the criminal, the murderer, is responsible for their own actions. Alternatively, we should believe that responsibility is only a fiction. It's only a construct, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. Some try to reconcile the two by saying that A, there is indeed a normatively valid and important practice of holding others responsible, and also everything in life is indeed probably predetermined. How do you reconcile these two? Well, this is what we call compatibilism, or more specifically, compatibilists that accept determinism. So for folks like, and I'm going to list out a few names here, so I hope you're not too confused, Peter Strawson and Galen Strawson, and also to some extent David Schumacher, their view and their argument is moral responsibility is justified as a practice, even if indeed we are not causally ultimately responsible, or rather, even if we don't have the agency or the ability to have acted otherwise. Even if everything is indeed predetermined, even if we have no ability realistically to have acted otherwise, we are still responsible. Why? Well, Peter Strawson introduces the following argument in a seminal paper, I think published in 1960s, 1968, I think, not too sure. You know, look it up, don't want to make up the years. But effectively, Peter Strawson posits that when we say that, suppose I am C, and C says that B is responsible, okay, for some X. What C is really saying there, or what C is really expressing there, rather, is a degree, and assuming that X is a negative act or a negative state of affairs. What C is really saying or doing there, rather, is C resents B for X. There's a view of that C harbors the reactive attitude of resentment towards B for X. Whoops, not X. S, it's X. So a more grounded example may well be in debate land. I am C, I'm a team that took fourth. And I think B is a terrible judge. Now, obviously, let's set aside all the disclaimers about, there are no terrible judges, there are only terrible debaters, and all sorts of judging is warranted and justified, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to pretend that, actually, I'm just going to say that I think a lot of that is often used to excuse bad judging. Anyway, so C resents B for X. And the team that took the fourth resents the judge for giving them the fourth unjustifiably. And therefore they say XXX is responsible for giving me a really bad call. Now, that feeling of resentment is, according to Strawson, in the way he describes moral responsibility, a moral attitude that maybe in the context of debating, it might be a bit inappropriate, but suppose that what the judge did was the judge actively interrupted your speeches and were very rude and mocked you, which is genuinely inequitable and very, very, well, displayed some abhorrent behaviors as a human being. Suppose that's indeed what happened, and therefore there's resentment directed towards the judge. Well, then in this case, the resentment or the attitude of resentment reflects, per Strawson's account, some degree of responsibility that C holds B responsible for interrupting C's speech, giving them a terrible call, not listening to C's arguments, discriminating against C's team, blah, blah, blah. So for Strawson, the practice of holding someone responsible stems from or derives from that fundamental foundational attitude of resentment harbored towards the purported subject of resentment. Now, is he texting something? Oh, yeah, please do copy and paste everything to YouTube stream. Actually, sorry, can you paste the YouTube stream so I can also type in it myself? Maybe that would be helpful. Is there a link? I'll pretend that there's a link. Okay, I'm going to continue. So the gist here is, oh, thank you. Let me just click. Sorry, give me 10 seconds to click on this thing. Is he texting something? Oh, right. There are people watching there as well. Okay. Terribly sorry. Cool. No worries. I'm going to keep my YouTube section open as well so I can see the questions coming in. So going back to the argument or the discussion we had just then, where we were talking about responsibility, then for Strawson that leads, the solution to determinism is to say, even if we accept that determinism is true, in real life situations, we still resent others for certain actions and behaviors, right? I resent you if you lied to me. I resent you if you kill my best friend. I resent you if you seriously maim or injure me. And this is because I'm holding you responsible. And this sense of responsibility or this concept of responsibility is not primitive. What is primitive here is my attitude of resentment towards that very individual or that very actor, blah, 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 etc. Now, obviously, you might think, okay, this doesn't make much sense because if I stub my toe on a table or I hit a table with my toe and I feel pain, I go, ow, and I say, I hate the table. I resent the table. That makes no sense because I can't hold the table responsible. So surely, there's a counterexample here to what I said just then about moral responsibility, that actually, maybe the idea or the criterion of resentment isn't so potent or so, useful a conceptual explanation for responsibility. Well, think again, because Strawson obviously knows that you can't hold a table responsible. You also can't hold dead things responsible for, the inanimate non-actions or for interactions you have with inanimate objects. And that's why when people say, I hate my laptop, I really resent my laptop, beyond just a discursive gesture, there may not be that much substance to it because you can't really hold responsible a bloody laptop. You can technically smash it, but that wouldn't really hold it to account either. That would only induce further costs upon yourself. Trust me, I've done that before. I've smashed my laptop onto pavement. It was a painful experience. I damaged the environment. I felt very guilty about it. Not good. Anyway, so the gist of the matter is there are what we call exempting and excusing circumstances. So the first criterion by which you are exempt from being, or whatever X is exempt from being held responsible, is if X does not have the capacity to engage or partake in moral reasoning. So for instance, you're talking about, say, a plant or a table, or even indeed by extension, children that lack accurate or adequate understandings of morality and therefore are not in a position to act or behave morally. So that's one subset of individuals that you might say are exempted from responsibility. And that is how Strawson avoids the reductio ad absurdum, that he is proposing an account of responsibility that proves too much. The second rejoinder he launches is that they are excusing circumstances, that there are circumstances by which you're excused from responsibility because you either had no intention or you did not foresee the very act that you are carrying out. So for instance, if I walk in the street and I step on a slab on a pavement, and that slab is connected to a bomb that detonates, and that detonation of the bomb then leads to the detonation of 10 other bombs 100 kilometers away, so I'm not affected by it, and that kills someone's dog and also injures, that said, someone very heavily, and indeed not fatally though, so that person's still capable of feeling something. Suppose they then find out that I stepped in a slab or the stone slab and that caused a chain reaction, they might still resent me, but that does not constitute resentment that justifies or warrants holding me responsible, because there's no reasonable way by which I could have foreseen that slab being connected to the wires and connected then to a bomb that would self-detonate. So this is effectively the two sets of accepting circumstances that Strawson identifies and poses as or in his account of responsibility. Why am I explaining or saying all of this? Is it because really I'm very responsible or irresponsible rather? No, it's because I think in a lot of debates about free will, or rather in debates about holding folks responsible, people often jump from, everything is predetermined to, there's no sense of responsibility. Why are you holding X and Y responsible? Free will was a myth, yada, yada, yada. That, in my opinion, ladies and gents, lands you a fat and square bad. So I won't mention speaks here because obviously my conception of speaks apparently is, I've been told, are different from others. But I'll just say that making arguments of that sort would get you nowhere apart from a big fat no thank you red cross. So unless you're a fan of Red Cross, I genuinely recommend that you don't make arguments as such. But obviously from the other side, it's also quite hard to rebut that claim. And usually the response I see is, well, you know, you could have acted otherwise because like clearly some other people of that background, they didn't commit a crime. So like this is a rejoinder I always see in criminal justice debate. One side says poor people are always systemically induced into committing more crimes. I think that's a pretty offensive claim without further backing up. But suppose you can explain that quite well, you know, and if that's indeed explained well, I also think it's a claim that's worth dealing with. And then the other side comes back up and says, oh, but there's some poor people that don't commit crimes. That is not a rebuttal. That is literally just saying, well, you know, some folks get injured by putting their hands into fire. But look, Mary and also Sam didn't injure their hands when they put their hands into fire. That's a terrible rebuttal. The actual rejoinder goes somewhere along the lines as such. One side might say, and might indeed succeed in proving causal determinism. The other side's rejoinder is not to try and find counterexamples to say that, oh, look, you could have acted otherwise because clearly people from the same community are very analogizable against one another, or that it doesn't have to be the case if you're from this background, you commit crimes. That is a lazy response. I think a more interesting response is to say, obviously, there are reasons to think that your circumstances do play a role in shaping your actions. Fine. And there are also good reasons to think that your intentions and the extent to which you could have acted otherwise are constrained by your own conditions. Blah, blah, blah. Fine. But at the end of the day, the practice of resenting someone and holding individuals responsible if they pass that minimum threshold of agency is one that defines moral responsibility. It doesn't require free will to be true metaphysically in order for this fiction, for this practice of responsibilization to be justified, because that by definition is what moral responsibility is about. It's about our attitudes towards one another, our reasonable or rationalizable judgments towards each other with certain constraints, like for instance, exempting you when you had no agency, or exempting you when you had no sort of excusing circumstances. And clearly then you can bring in the counterexample that you raised there to say, but very clearly, if I were as a second person or a third person observer judging the situation, I would still reasonably resent you because you could have reasonably acted otherwise. You could have adopted alternative measures of acquiring wealth. You could have adopted alternative ways of expressing your anger at the system. You could have done all of these other things. Now, I don't want to enter the quagmire of judging the permissibility of violence, because I genuinely think that's another quagmire that I don't have the expertise to comment on, especially given the time constraints we have. But if we purely look at it from the point of view of committing murder and say you're from a background that allegedly makes you more likely to commit murder, whatever that may be. And I think we have to be very careful about the way we make the argument here. Even if that's indeed true, this does not exempt you from responsibility because, or rather, this does not prove, rather, that moral responsibility doesn't apply or doesn't hold in this case, let alone legal responsibility, because of all the reasons outlined above, that moral responsibilization is a practice that's valuable to society, has both instrumental and intrinsic value, and indeed, in general, we hold others responsible, even if they technically struggled or there were constraints on their abilities to have done otherwise, so long as they could have still done otherwise, and that we can prove that they could have done otherwise, indeed, maybe then in relation to other folks that we compare against, but also perhaps ideally in explaining what the option sets are available to them and what those option sets are, then we can say that there's a permission to hold these folks accountable, even if free will is not true. How do you prove the lack of agency claims? Perfect question. And I think it's often a shoddily done exercise. A lot of folks that I've seen just say, well, you don't have choice because you're very poor, so you have to steal. I think that's just lazy argumentation. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you have to steal. Just because you're poor, it means you need money. But why exactly then do you turn to stealing? You might say there are no other ways for you to derive sustainable income. Or culturally speaking, you're ingrained by indoctrination or upbringing to think that stealing is a permissible form of revenue generating activity. Or alternatively, because you feel insecure, and that sense of instability and insecurity leads you to distrust the very institutions that generate stable and legal revenue streams. Therefore, you turn to crime. But there's always more to the picture than just saying you're poor. And I think when people assert that you're very poor, therefore you steal, it's not, setting aside the offensiveness of that. It's just bad argument. It's just unwarranted argumentation. So moving on beyond that, where were we? So we talked about an introduction to moral philosophy and the common issues in moral philosophy. I realize I spent too much time here. I want to move on to applying all of the stuff we talked about and indeed philosophy at large to debating. So a lot of folks have asked me, how do you debate debates, or how exactly do you incorporate moral philosophy into debating? So I think there are broadly 5 ways in which you can do that. And this, by the way, are both ways that can allow you to prove principal arguments, but also methods by which you can incorporate and assimilate debates or arguments concerning principal discussions or principal disputes into your particular arguments and claims. Great. So let me just, give me a second. Sorry, I was getting some water. Right. So how do you incorporate moral philosophy into debating? 5 methods. Thought experiment and intuition pumping. Secondly, established theory and frameworks. Thirdly, building arguments and principal arguments from the bottom up, from scratch. Fourthly, through analogy and parallel drawing and also existing precedents. And 5th, by flipping or refutation or transformation of other sides' arguments by induction. Let me just explain them one by one, because I think things would clear up after some explanation. So, broadly speaking, when you're talking about the idea of thought experiment and intuition pumping, now I've noticed that a lot of folks think that when we talk about thought experiments, it's just akin to saying, oh, it's just asking rhetorical questions, right? Like, have you ever thought of being locked up in a cage, being denied of the opportunity to wander freely on the green plains in Asia or something? Well, that's how most lions feel when they're locked up in zoos. Guys, that's not a thought experiment. What's a thought experiment, though, is I think a more well-designed and more rigorously tailored argument that seeks to tease out a particular intuitive conclusion. So an example for a thought experiment is Bob the Governor, the example I brought up just then. But another thought experiment that's quite frequently deployed is the utility machine. So here again, I'm going to do a bit of a straw poll. And please answer with A or B. Very simple. Suppose you're someone who's leading a mediocre life. So it's not a terrible life. You're quite happy. It's like above average. And one day, Brian Wong comes up to you and says, hey, I have a machine. This machine, if you plug into it, would allow you to live the best life ever in your dreams. But it's not real. It ain't real, okay? It ain't real. But alternatively, you don't plug into this machine, you'll live a life that's pretty comfortable, but still mediocre at its core. But it's real. So basically, the choices here are between San Junipero. If you've watched that episode in the Black Mirror, it was such a gorgeous episode, so touching. And no San Junipero. So if you're in favor of SJ, please type SJ. If you're in favor of NSJ, please type NSJ. NSJ means you don't want to live in that fake world or virtual reality. And just to be clear, devs, what is devs? Okay, just to be clear, your lifespan's the same. So you'll live virtually or in real life for the same number of years. NSJ, NSJ, NSJ. Right, okay. I presume most folks say NSJ. The actual point or reason why NSJ is preferable is besides the point. It has to do with some complex axiological discussions concerning what makes life valuable. And obviously, we all place a certain degree of premium and value upon authenticity and the veracity of our experiences, or verisimilitude, actually. But I'm not going to talk about that because that's besides the point. But that's a thought experiment. Whether or not you want San Junipero or not, that's a thought experiment. I'm inviting you to consider what matters in life, and if the only thing that matters is utility, and only thing that matters is a pleasurable life. A thought experiment should be designed with two things in mind. The first is, what is the end objective that you want to convince people of? Don't design a thought experiment as an open-ended question. I've seen people come up here and say, Judge, would you prefer a cat with no hair or a dog with no legs? And I just sit there thinking, you know, what exactly is going on in this debate? I genuinely don't understand what's happening. You might call me petulant, but I might say, you know, I'm doggedly confused. Anyway, so that's not useful. You should always have a clear objective in mind when you're bringing in a thought experiment, whether it be in proving that there are certain claims that we value as intrinsically important, independent of utility or independent of other broader outcomes. So for instance, whether or not something is true, authentically real, or indeed something that we can touch and feel and concrete and all of that, that is a point that I want to establish, that we value authenticity, even if there's greater utility on a comparative. So that's the objective. I have a clear objective in mind. The second question, and after establishing the objective, what you want to do with a thought experiment, is the setup. And when you're setting up a thought experiment, make sure you lay the facts clear and make sure that you're nudging people through your language to accept that very conclusion. So for instance, here's another thought experiment. Going back to Bob the Governor. Now, most of you would say you should definitely try and save the future generation. Now, what did I do, or what did I say in a setup that helped nudge you guys towards it, even if you weren't too sure to begin with? Well, I said things like, well, the lives of those that would otherwise have lived, and now, because of your pollution, would not have lived, would clearly be much better. I also hyperbolized the belief or the thought that, or rather, I dramatized, thereby ridiculing, or thereby ridiculed the claim that, you know, the failure to stop pollution is in fact instrumental in ensuring the existence of a future generation. I ridiculed it, right? And that's how you guys are like, this is an absurd argument. I'm going to prioritize not polluting, blah, 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 blah. The way you set up and run a thought experiment can have active impacts on how convincing the particular desired outcome or implication is in terms of your thought experiment. So these are the two observations I'll note concerning thought experiments. And also these are two tricks that allow you to make your thought experiments more convincing. Be very careful though, that sometimes thought experiments that are too complicated can backfire. They backfire because fundamentally some folks listen to it and don't get the gist of what you're saying and then just drop it entirely. And then in some other cases, you know, you might set a thought experiment, convince people of the conclusion, but not necessarily therefore allow for people to draw and extrapolate from it in a context of the motion. So your thought experiment might simply be irrelevant. So in a debate about whether or not parents or doctors should handle medical decisions, and you decide to raise a thought experiment about the machine, and you say, I'd very much prefer something that is true, something that is real, and something that is fake. But that is irrelevant, because neither side's going to say, I prefer fake outcomes. I think parents are better for fake outcomes. That's not what the debate is about. So don't just raise thought experiments just for the sake of raising them, right? You're not there to provide a talking shop routine. You're not there to give up stand-up comedy routine. You're there to provide tailor-made argumentation to demonstrate the claims that you're making and also to substantiate the conclusions, blah, blah, blah. Cool. The second method, or the second technique in argumentation and also principle generation, is drawing upon established theory and frameworks. And that's where reading, right? And that's where understanding and looking at existing moral philosophical texts are really helpful here. And that's also, I guess, what I'm trying to do in my lecture. I'm trying to provide an opportunity for you guys to be exposed to existing theories and arguments, etc. So before I move on any further, I will indeed entertain certain requests by sending you guys a short book list of recommended texts where you can draw upon stock theory and stock arguments. So J. Smart and Bernard Williams, their discussion on for and against utilitarianism, I believe this was in 1973. And then there's also Derek Parfit on what matters, Robert Nozick on anarchy, state, and utopia, Peter Singer, and more. These are all folks that can provide you with the very theories and arguments that you need to quote, to cite, to use in debates. And how do you integrate existing frameworks into your argumentation? Well, the worst way of doing so is name dropping. So I used to do this way back when I was a wee novice. So 4 years ago, 6 years ago. I'm so old. So 6 years ago, I would go out there and say, according to Nozick, 1974, this is obviously an absurd idea because it violates side constraints and renders individuals non-autonomous. And then the judges go like, Brian, what on earth are you talking about? And I say, well, I am talking about something on earth. I'm just talking about something you don't understand. And then that debate obviously ends up with me landing a very fat and square fourth. So congratulations to Brian. That's a terrible idea. But what you can do, though, is to say, look, we obviously all purchase a certain principle. So maybe it's a principle of non-aggression, that it's wrong to aggress upon others, especially when they're non-consenting, or it's wrong to invade others' private space, blah, 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 blah. Given that to be the case, let's apply that to this particular case. So be clear about what you're citing and drawing upon. Don't just cite a book. No one knows what you're talking about in the book. No one knows what the book is saying. No one knows why exactly that author wrote this particular claim. But most folks in debating tend to know particular generalizable and generalized concepts. And that, thankfully, has entered the public and common consciousness of debating. So then, if you cite and base your claim upon, say, these commonly accepted tenets that you or anyone else might easily know, what you can then subsequently do is to say, let's apply this principle to this particular context. So maybe the motion is like, this house believes that we should invade X, which is a failed state. And in PM, you want to say it is principally justified for us to do so. Why? Because the right in the path of a state to govern itself, or in a part of the government to govern itself, is contingent upon its legitimacy. Clearly, legitimacy has three different criteria, X, Y, and Z, and clearly all three criteria have been violated. So firstly, not harming the people. Well, clearly, the state is harming its people. Secondly, competent governance for most folks. Clearly, this government is not governing competently for most folks in its own jurisdiction. And thirdly, that fundamentally, there are no better alternative candidates in governance. Well, clearly, there are better candidates in governance, and ergo, the state doesn't have that claim to territorial sovereignty, or rather jurisdictional sovereignty in that sense. So when you're trying to explore or articulate why exactly this principle is applicable, don't just cite the principle and then leave it there. Cite the principle and apply it. Apply it to the context of the debate. Explain what you can draw from it, and explain why that is something that is so important overall. So I hope that's clear so far. Great. Third mechanism or third method which is first order reasoning. And this is often the most challenging and difficult method, so I don't usually recommend to folks that you adopt it. However, what does first order reasoning really mean? It just means, thinking about more carefully how you can build a moral framework from scratch. And frankly speaking, having done 7 to 8 years of competitive debating, there are only a handful of debaters, in my opinion, who can genuinely whip up a moral framework from scratch and from the facts that are given. So it's quite a challenging method that, nevertheless, if done well, indeed, if recognized and understood by a judge that recognizes creative arguments or rewards innovation, if done well, it could land you in a very sweet spot. But if done poorly or incompletely, you could well be risking not just a second or a third, but a clear fourth in the context of the debate. So how do you build an argument, a principle theory from scratch? Well, the raw ingredients are all there. You can either build it from drawing analogies, which I'm going to talk about in a sec, drawing analogies with other similar situations, or by making observations about what the particular context and the moral circumstances demand. So for instance, if you're trying to construct a principle for, say, wartime ethics, you might say, look, the very nature of war is that it is filled to the brim with uncertainties. The fog of war necessarily percolates through to every single aspect of our moral decision making. There's a very high level of uncertainty, and there's a very high level of stakes on both sides of the house. So what therefore really matters then is doing something that secures a minimum level of moral rightness, or secures a minimum level of moral goodness. Ergo, what really matters in wartime is not following the rules, is not bringing about the best possible consequences, but instead minimizing the possible harms to the greatest extent, or minimizing the possible moral harms that you're inflicting upon yourself and others as much as possible. Therefore, speaker, I posit you should not be utilitarian when you're fighting a war, but instead a risk-averse consequentialist that seeks to minimize risk, or that seeks to maximize the worst possible case scenario, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, the principle we should adopt here is not to undertake the gamble that may or may not have a huge payoff, but instead to prioritize the certain payoff that may well be less significant, but at least guaranteed. Are there any examples of debates online? No, but I have seen a very interesting attempt at first order moral reasoning. And this is Berlin IV 2019 in a debate concerning a world without lying. And this was a speech given by Darian and also Franca. So it was a case by Darian and Franca. And I really loved the case. The case went something as follows. It said, the right to lie, or rather, it is wrong fundamentally to prefer a world without lying, because lying in many ways transforms you. It nudges you to perform actions, to think differently, to make decisions, to use your body in a way that you would not have otherwise have done. And premise 2, beyond the fact that it influences your calculus and how you act, lying itself also rests upon faulty grounds that you would not personally wish to act upon, because by very definition, you're deceived, right? You don't think what you're being told here is false, but it is actually false. So you fail to recognize, or you fail to be, to be cognizant of these facts. So not only have you been induced into acting in a particular way, you've also been induced into doing so against your own will. And given that what you're now doing is indeed utilizing your body and performing certain forms of labor, lying is no different then from violence. It is no different from inducing you to act in particular ways that bring about substantial harms in terms of denting your autonomy to your own actions. Therefore, lying, even if indeed it is permissible for good reasons in terms of instrumental outcomes, lying is still morally wrong, because it is akin to some degree of coercion or some degree of sanctioned coercion. And therefore, a world without lying might be one where consequentially you have worse outcomes overall, but that's still worth it, or that's still justified, because at least you're not being conscripted or coerced by others into performing actions against your own wishes. So I must say that was a pretty ingenious argument. Now, there are obviously loads of ways of refuting that claim. Like, A, you can say, clearly you would have retrospectively consented to a world where you're better off in welfare and also have your rights protected, even if that means sometimes you act against your own will. Or B, you're not really acting against your own autonomous wishes when actually your autonomous wishes are adaptive, so therefore adjust on the basis or in response to what you do. Or C, there's no difference between a lie driving your action and the fact driving your action, because we're coerced by technically everything. See what we said just now about determinism. We're coerced by everything we take in, everything we read, everything we eat. So it's not clear why a false fact causing us to act in a way is any worse than a true fact causing us to act in any other way, right? Unless we're banning people instructing others to behave in particular ways, or teaching people things, or teaching people particular concepts entirely, then clearly the violence, the so-called ontological violence that lying perpetuates, is non-exclusive. So all of these are possible rebuttals. And that means I don't think the argument is like completely impervious. Indeed, I think it is quite vulnerable to challenges. But at the very same time, I thought it was a brilliant argument in the context of the debate it was made, and a particular way it was made, not just through analogies, but also through first order reasoning. So I guess that's an example that I would always cite or quote in teaching first order reasoning. It was intricate, it was well argued, it was also quite intact and cogent in that sense. Cool. Moving on to the fourth technique. I'm sorry if I'm rambling on. I think I say more things than I'd originally expected. So the fourth method of principal argumentation is analogization. So what I mean by analogization, basically drawing parallels, right? And one subvariant here is to say there are precedents for this principle in action, like literally people in certain jurisdictions already accept this principle. So maybe, for instance, in trying to prove statute of limitations or justifying statutes of limitations, we might say, look, in certain jurisdictions, it is currently, you're not allowed to sue someone or charge an alleged criminal for actions they carried out 50 or 60 years ago. So statutes of limitations have already been imposed in quite a lot of common law and whatnot jurisdictions. Therefore, we should extend it to this case as well. Fine. But I think this subvariant ends up risking two things. One, there's a risk of you entering into an example quagmire where the other team just says, yeah, sure, X, Y, Z as countries have adopted this, but what about ABC, Alpha, Beta, Gamma? They haven't adopted this particular practice. Ergo, this is an overarchingly morally unjustifiable or unjustified practice. And the second risk that you incur is you might also run into the is-ought problem. And here's what I mean by that. So just because in certain countries, the medical systems prioritize saving the elderly over the able-bodied, saving the able-bodied and the young over the elderly because of scarce resources. Just because that's what's happening right now doesn't mean it ought to be the case. Just because, that some folks are keen on doxing people online and sharing their private information online doesn't make that practice justified. Just because some countries stipulate that you must have very high tax rates in order to cover for, say, welfare and welfare costs that hike up during epidemics or during crises, doesn't mean it's justified. There are lots of things that happen in the world around us that are true, but they're not therefore, or at the very least in virtue of their occurrence, they're not therefore justified. So when you cite these precedents to say my principle stands, you must be very careful here that these are precedents or these examples that people buy as legitimate. Because if the other side just stands up and says, yeah, we're happy to change that too, then you run into serious trouble. So it's an actual example for this from a debate, I think Talent 2007 Euros final, is the following exchange. Will Jones in PM stands up and says, look, we should ban, I think, Nazi symbolism or Nazi symbols because they are fundamentally offensive, fundamentally destructive, and have all of these harms. It is morally egregious. And then CO stands up in POIs and says, well, if you ban Nazi symbolism and public display of that, they will still do X, Y, and Z that basically invoke or cause a lot of offense, right? And basically induce the same level of emotional harm, maybe just not through the ways that Will Jones talked about. And Will Jones' reply, which is quite interesting and potentially hilarious, was to say, we will ban those things too. Bye-bye. Now, I'm not saying that that POI was bad. What I'm saying here is that by pushing that parallel against OG in a way that probably undermined the actual potency of that objection, because we then looked at CO's case and we then thought a bit more about that POI. What was really perhaps said there is that if you ban explicit symbols, even if you do so, you can't ban implicit symbolism and, you know, dog whistling and implicit symbolism could just as well be as damaging, if not more damaging, than these explicit symbols or explicit displays of racism and anti-Semitism. So that's basically what the actual exchange could have been or should have been. But the POI made it sound as if CO was pushing OG on certain issues. Say, would you defend banning X, Y, and Z? And it gave PM a very, very easy time, as he just said, yeah, we'll ban those things too. Because the moment you set up a principle, you have to be cautious that that analogy that you're setting up the principle with backfires. It backfires by effectively undermining your own credibility, but also allowing the other side the chance to grandstand to say, yeah, we'll do that too. We'll ban that too. We stand for limitations along those lines as well. And that's something that you don't want to give opportunity, offer the opportunity to the other side to do, right? Because that effectively enables them to push the ball back into your court, to force you to defend either why the stance is so problematic, which you don't want to spend time or waste time in defending and explaining, or indeed it forces you to drop that push and then focus on other attacks. So when you're setting up analogies, especially in rebuttal or especially in response, make sure that you're forcing the other side into a corner such that they have no other choices than to admit defeat. Don't give them the opportunity to grandstand or flip the analogy on your heads there. But more generally speaking, analogies are useful in constructing principal arguments. Therefore, in my opinion, or they're best utilized as such and they're most optimal when it's not a direct analogy, when you're not saying, look, we already did this in status quo, blah, 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 it's therefore justified. But instead, a good analogy should have two parts to it. First, a rock solid principle. So the right to self-defense usually is accepted as, well, basically near universally, if not universally, or alternatively, the right to, or the duty to not harm innocent civilians, or the duty to rescue folks that are struggling or starving, or those who are in severe and dire need. These are near universally endorsed and accepted. Then you say that's principle. Secondly, I think this principle extends to the particular case I'm talking about here. So when we're looking at helping, bailing out companies, but I think this is a terrible principle. We're just giving an example. Alternatively, rescuing people stranded overseas as a result of COVID, you are saying, look, I think this humanitarian principle, this Samaritan principle of rescue extends. It extends to rescuing and bringing home folks that are stranded overseas currently as a result of COVID-19. This way, or when the principle is set up as such, the analogy becomes far more well-grounded, because you're not just saying this is true, you're saying this is a well-established, normatively accepted fact, and there's sufficient analogizability between that and the current circumstances that we're debating over, that you reckon there's a parallel, or there's a decent mirror to be formed and had here. This way of analogization has two merits over the previous approach, which is citing status quo. A, it enables you to convince the judges that you're standing on the moral high ground, or a normatively salient ground at the very least. So you're not just pointing to the status quo and saying, this happens, that happens. You're saying this is important and this is justified, guys. But B, it also means that you don't need to waste time then in extrapolating or inferring and drawing out from the first case what the underlying principle is, because it's obvious what the underlying principle is. It's in fact stated and assumed to be the case. And all you're doing here is just to apply that very principle and stretch that principle to this particular context. So in practice, when we look at sort of analogization and parallel forming, we often use for in conjunction with to. You use to give the name and label for and what you do in the for, and you use for to flesh out what you mean by what you do in to. So that's how you deploy two or more of these techniques concurrently. And finally, flipping or refutation by induction. So the reason why I put this into the principal methodology section is I think a lot of folks often think that when you're making principal arguments, you have to start from scratch, that you have to build the argument from bottom up. But the reality is, in debating, you have the opponents. You have people that you're facing, right? That supposedly, your arguments are clashing. And hint, hint, sometimes your arguments need not be clashing. You might very well find yourselves agreeing on the same objectives, agreeing on the same metrics. So if anything, there are times when you say, I recognize that they have this metric on blah's side. I accept that. And this is precisely why we should insert your flip, believe in emotion. Let me give an example. Suppose emotion is this house believes that post-colonial states, or former colonial states rather, should offer their former colonies unconditional citizenship. So people from their former colonies, unconditional citizenships. PM spends 5 minutes proving why there are reparative duties arising from colonialism, and they do it quite well. If you're OO, you don't initially at least have a principal argument. You're like, what is my principle? So maybe you can run sort of the rights of those folks in your original country, or rather in the former colonial states, and the rights of those folks living there. You can also run stuff about national security and also duties towards those left over or those who suffer from brain drain. But suppose you don't have any of these principles with you. You don't have any ammunition. You're just stuck there thinking, like, what can I do to win this debate? Well, funnily enough, all you can say is, after listening to the PM speech, all you need to do is to say, they gave you 5 minutes of analysis about why the reparative principle stands. We agree. And that is why we fundamentally think that the best way to repair for your own wrongs is to maximize the well-being of your former colonies. And this motion sabotages that. So you don't even need to prove, that you have obligations to care for those who are left behind and hurt by brain drain. You don't even need to prove that, because as OO, as OP, your OG gave you the principle. They gave you that analysis. So all you needed to say, if that's indeed true, we take them on the ground. We flip it. We win that. So sometimes principal arguments do not require you to build it from scratch. All we need to do is to spot it in the other side's case and claim it is your own. So that's the final way in which you can construct a so-called principle or moral argument, following on from the previous 4 methods that we talked about just then. Now I want to set everyone a sort of 2-minute break, and we'll come back at 1:24 GMT time, at which I would then sort of start the second half, or final quarter of our session today, which is on other debates or other common debates in moral philosophy, and also answer some of the FAQs I've seen you guys type, or some of the folks type into the Google spreadsheet. So I will answer those FAQs and also offer some thoughts on other debates in moral philosophy, such as animal rights. And we can, let's regroup at 1:24 GMT time. Thank you very much. Okay, dokes, I'm back. Great. Lovely. So, moving on to the next section, or the so-called final section today, let's talk a bit about the question of animal rights. Why exactly do animals have rights, if at all, and how exactly are we to make sense of their rights? Because that's a question that I've heard a lot of you ask. So why should we care about animal rights in general? in general, setting aside the most general reasons, which is that caring for animal rights informs our understanding of animal rights activism and also climate change related duties. In debate land, I think animal rights are usually helpful in debates where they're directly involved. So stuff like animal testing, eating meat, banning zoos, yada, yada, yada. Because trust me, I think there's a very potent case to be made to say that in the case of banning zoos, we should not ban them because of human entertainment value and the entertainment value it brings to human beings, and why that's always more important than the intuitive prevention of harms induced upon animals. It's a hardline stance, but it's not an untenable stance or an infeasible stance. It's perfectly reasonable to think that, unless, of course, you hear argumentation about animal rights. The second context in which animal rights analysis is useful is just debates about climate change, about transformations to the environment, where they are not necessarily the central stakeholder in the debate, but at the very least important and relevant. And when it comes to tie breaking or choosing between two competing scenarios, animal rights could make or break their tilting scale. But above all, learning about animal rights is useful because we can then use the logic and the reasoning we apply usually in animal rights debates. We can take that and apply the reasoning to other contexts, whether that be corporate personhood and corporate rights, or rights of entities, rights of organizations, and rights of inanimate objects to the extent that they exist. Cool. So let's get into it. Why do animals have rights? Well, we have 5 participants left in the chat. Does anyone want to start us off with a potential answer concerning why you think animals might have rights? Nope. Okay. Well, great. I guess you can say that's our animal nature coming through. So let me just throw this out there. Now, some folks say that animals have rights because animals basically are capable of, and indeed do possess, interests, i.e., they have particular dimensions of well-being that affect, or rather are affected by circumstances and events that befall them. Whether that be in the form of preferences. So some say that animals have preferences to roam freely, to not be killed, to survive, to live happy lives, happy tree friends, all of that. And then some others say that animals have interest in leading lives with good well-being, or a reasonably decent level of well-being. So that means that they should be able to lead lives free from torture, free from abuse, and where fundamentally they are treated with at least some respect. And then still some others say that animals have the interest to not feel pain. So this is an argument Peter Singer raises in the line with a lot of the utilitarian material and utilitarian literature that we see out there. But Peter Singer says, look, animals can feel pain. And animals do feel pain empirically. A lot of the actions that we induce upon animals, exactly, Aniket, a lot of the actions that we carry out towards animals could cause them to either be in pain or to feel pleased. And in particular, though, it is the induction of pain that we ought to avoid. Pain is bad regardless of whomever is affected by it. If I say, oh, Bob and Sam are, what's the verb for pain? I've agonized them. I've inflicted pain upon them. Then even if I'm not Bob or Sam, I could say, oh, confidently, that's a bad thing for them. It's bad for them that they're in pain, or at least Peter Singer thinks as such. Now, in practice, we obviously realize in the case of human beings, some human beings do enjoy feeling pain. That's a completely different story, but obviously some folks are masochistic, but that's an aside. But in the case of animals, we assume that they're not into feeling pain, or they're not pleased by feeling pain. So indeed, things like the butchering, the killing of animals, the slaughter and torture of animals is not something that is good for the animals. And to the extent that it's not good for the animals and are capable of feeling pain, we ought to care for reducing pain across all contexts, not just for human beings. So that is a more developed sort of interest-based account of animal welfare. And then some folks like Joel Feinberg then say, because animals have interests in not feeling pain, in feeling pleasure, that means that they therefore have the rights to not feel pain and to also feel pleasure. So this is what we call the interest theory of rights. Let me just type that out here. Feinberg, interest theory of rights. Now, this is in sharp contrast against the will theory of rights. The will theory of rights argues that individuals only possess rights if they can waive or issue requests for others to comply with the demands concerning these rights. So effectively, if someone is incapable of demanding that others comply or incapable of requesting that others ignore their demands over these rights, then such an individual cannot be said to possess rights. So the will theory of rights entails that all right holders must be able to control when or not that right is exercised and delivered / actualized in practice, whereas the interest theory or interest theorists of rights don't think so. They say you can still have rights even if you don't have the ability to alter the exercising and the performing or rather the fulfillment of these rights. Cool. So in the context of animal rights, at the very least, will theory of rights folks, or will theorists, unless they are super enamored and super confident about animals' abilities to reason and also issue commands, most folks that believe in a will theory of rights don't believe that animals have rights, even if animals do have interest in avoiding pain, and we ought to care for these interests to some extent or another. Whereas those who believe in the interest theory of rights would say not only do animals have interest in not feeling pain, but such interests also actively translate into rights and claims that these animals can issue upon human beings. So going back to the question about whether or not you can wrong an animal, well, here's $1 million answer. It's to say it depends. So it's very boring. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to respond to that question, Annika, in just a sec. But exactly. So the boring answer is it depends, right? So according to the will theory of rights, you can wrong animals by frustrating their very rights and also violating the demands and claims and all of that, setting aside other ways in which wronging could occur without utilitarian harms. Whereas if you believe in the interest theory of rights, the only way in which you can wrong an animal is, if you believe in a will theory of rights, the only way in which you can wrong an animal is if the animal just so happens to possess the capacity to issue and request the delivery and also the fulfillment of their rights. And elsewise, they don't have rights under the will theory. And therefore, it is impossible for you to wrong an animal because you can't really fail to comply with their rights-based demands. Now, obviously, there are other ways in which you can wrong the animals, but those are rare and also ways I don't think are pertinent necessarily to our moral discourse or our discussion right now. Whereas if you believe in the interest theory of rights, you could say you are wronging an animal whilst you're harming them, because you're inducing a comparatively worse state of affairs and state of well-being upon them. So that's the difference between the two theories, and I hope that answers the question about whether you can wrong animals. Don't some human beings also lack the things these will theorists talk about? Yes, precisely. And that is why, again, animal rights debates have some interesting or illuminating insights when we apply the insights drawn to other contexts, such as the rights of humans with impaired capacity. Now, this is very sensitive territory, so I don't want to get into too much detail because I think it takes a long while to unpack. But Peter Singer has come under a lot of flack because some folks believe that he analogizes or compares in his theory mentally incapacitated or rather mentally disabled individuals to animals. And he's drawn a lot of criticism for this analogy. And indeed, in my opinion, I do not think that Singer needs to bite the bullet and say, for some bizarre reason, or not bizarre, but for his own reasons, that the two of them are equivalent. But even when we look at the analogy through his lenses, I'm not trying to rationalize his position, but I will note that the way Peter Singer makes the argument is often ignored by people. He's not saying that just because animals and humans of that sort should be treated the same, that those human beings are therefore not worthy of respect or care. What he's in fact saying is precisely because of that equivalence, we should also care for animals as much as we care for human beings. You can dispute that position and you can challenge that all you want, but I think it's important that we at least understand his position before we bash him for it, right? And the gist of the matter here is, yes, so Aniket, some human beings do lack the ability to A, demand the delivery, or B, to waive the fulfillment of those rights claims. And ergo, by will theorists of rights, they would say those human beings don't have rights. Now, I find this implication troubling, which is why I'm personally an interest theorist. And indeed, I think this is backed up by the fact that naturally, when we talk about these people, we would want to say they have rights. We don't just want to say they have interests, right? Because rights give them, to use Dawkins' language, gives their demands the sense of trumping urgency, the sense that it is of urgency and significance, or at least significant enough imperative for us to prioritize enshrining those rights over other competing objectives. So that is why I personally am an interest theorist, but will theorists, or most will theorists, tend to adopt the position Aniket mentions here, that for those individuals who do lack these capacities, they do not have rights. Anyway, where were we? We were talking about when animals have rights, and we talked about reasons why they might, and also answered the question about wrongness and explored some implications of this. Now, I want to just move on very quickly then to the second part of animal rights, i.e., to what extent, or rather, where do we draw the line for assigning animals rights? Like, what do animals possess that gives them rights? Well, Aniket says they feel pleasure and pain. So here's my question. If there's certain animals that, because of the way we breed them, through, I don't know, selective breeding or genetic engineering, whatever, I'm not a biologist, so I don't know the details here, but because of however we process them, these animals therefore end up incapable of experiencing pain and pleasure. If that's indeed the case, do we think these animals still have rights? What do we think? For those of you who think they do, please say yes. And for those of you who think they don't, please say no. Anyone? Okay. I will assume, okay, great. Yes. Any nays? Any no's? Alrighty. So effectively, the argument here, or rather, suppose you say they therefore do have rights. Aniket, why do you think they still have rights? They can't feel pain or pleasure. Why do you think so? Great. So a possible answer to help you resolve your conundrum is that they're still conscious. They're capable of experiencing the world about them. So even if they can't feel pain or pleasure, there might be cases in which what they prefer or what they wish to be true about the world around them are frustrated. So that's what we call frustration of preferences. Therefore, they're worse off. Or B, we might think that objectively speaking, they might have reduced welfare, or they might be placed in a worse state of affairs as a result of our actions. So one variant of that might be that we are fundamentally disrespecting them, or that we are treating them as if they were non-conscious or non-morally conscious agents. So it's a claim of disrespect. Even I think it's quite a tenuous claim to make. Another variant is that because they're conscious and there's certain actions that damage or inhibit their freedoms, say their ability to walk because you cut off the leg, or you chop off the leg of a lamb, which I think is terrible. But also, I think it's a bit hypocritical for me to say that because I'm a meat eater. So I'm just going to take that statement back and reflect upon my own carnivorism. Anyway, precisely because they have consciousness and there's certain actions that you can perform on them that inflict upon them that damage, even if they can't feel pain or pleasure, they are still in some way or another entitled to rights, like a right to bodily integrity, right to being able to have an intake body when they die, right to roam freely, freedom of movement, yada, yada, yada. So that perhaps answers the conundrum, right? Does it help you? Does it help answer your confusion, Aniket? That maybe that's an explanation in that sense, even if they can't feel pain or pleasure? Yeah? Yeah, cool. And then still, some folks say, wait, consciousness is a really low bar. Like, aren't computers conscious? If you think about it, they have memory, they store data. Some computers, because of AI programming and whatnot, like weak AI, not strong AI, mind you, can also perform, like, say, auto updates. Indeed, my MacBook keeps saying, please update me. Or they auto update whilst I'm asleep or whilst it's asleep. And then in some other cases, you know, the computer automatically closes apps that are malfunctioning. Surely then the computer is conscious. Now, the metaphysician inside me would groan at this remark. But I think there are two reasons why we might be a tad baffled or troubled by this observation more than we should be. The first is it is indeed quite hard to differentiate between the faculties and the capacities of a lamb, or rather a sheep, a horse, and a computer. And secondly, if anything, intuitively, the computer seems more intelligent than the sheep and the monkey, or whatever. So a rejoinder towards this might be that fundamentally computers are not self-conscious. And that because of the ways in which they're programmed, they do not see itself as a self. So therefore, there's a difference between animals and computers because one is self-conscious, the other one isn't. But this seems increasingly untenable as a proposed or possible distinction because, if anything, computers are quite self-conscious. Some of them refer to themselves as like, I am MacBook 1809 or something. Alternatively, I am Siri. And lamb, or rather chicken, sheep, monkeys, all of these animals, they don't really, at the very least from communicating with them to the extent you can, it's not clear if they recognize who selves or who themselves are. So if anything, self-consciousness has now been touted as a sort of rejoinder for a lot of pro-human speciesists to say, aha guys, actually it is not the case that animals are the same or other animals are the same as Homo sapiens, because only Homo sapiens have consciousness of themselves or self-consciousness and a recognition of themselves as agents and actors and whatnot. Now, my personal thought is this is a pretty convincing rejoinder and pushback because at the end of the day, it is indeed the case that goldfish don't understand themselves as selves, whereas I, Brian Wong, do understand I exist as a moral agent. Or rather, and a kit knows, and a kit exists, and a kit is aware of self-awareness. But this test also means that by associating human rights with self-consciousness, we are necessarily knocking out certain folks that may very well lack the capacity to be self-conscious because of genetic or biological deficiencies, and we're also including in a mix or in a bag cats that might be super intelligent, gorillas that might look at themselves in the mirror and say, aha, that's me. But I think this is an intuitive and a normative cost I'm willing to accept. That this is a bullet I'm willing to bite. Because at the end of the day, that means that there's some difference between human beings and the other animals that we can establish through normative argumentation, and then some difference between inanimate objects and animals that we can establish through the previous test of consciousness, that we've effectively created a three-tier system, a three-tiered model of rights, where you start with humans at the top, animals or other animals underneath that, and then inanimate objects. Now, animal rights activists would challenge what I say about self-consciousness. They say, what on earth are you talking about? Clearly, this test proves too little, or is too unsympathetic towards animals, is too self-serving, and also in imposing this test, what about all of those like babies and also infants and whatnot that are not self-conscious? And indeed, that's also why Peter Singer has again drawn a lot of flack for just suggesting the following. He says, because babies are not self-conscious and indeed lacks a lot of these higher order faculties and capacities that we do, there might be good reason to think that babies are not morally the same as human beings. But then he himself makes a case, and others who are very keen on attacking him and criticizing him have also made the claim that he made this case. Certainly, it wasn't helped by the fact that he kept saying things like this, that if you accept abortion, you must also accept infanticide. Because to him, Peter Singer sees abortion, or rather the fetus in abortion, as comparable to the infant in infanticide. And personally, my take here is the reason why we're uneasy with infanticide, even if you can be pro-abortion and also anti-infanticide concurrently, is quite straightforward, is that the objectives or the prerogatives that you want to achieve in inducing the termination of life in both cases, in one set of circumstances, you can achieve through other means. That is, in the case of infanticide, you can very much ensure that you protect the well-being and the welfare of the mother and comply with her wishes without killing that infant. Whereas in the case of the fetus, in the case of abortion, clearly, in order for you to respect the bodily autonomy and the rights of the mother, and I'm also exhibiting my own personal stance here, the only way, and perhaps the justified way, and pursuing that course of action is to terminate life of the fetus. And this is where I don't want to get into touch territory of abortion because we don't have much time, and I genuinely can spend 3 hours talking about it from a moral philosophy point of view. But very quickly, This is why I find the debate over whether or not a fetus is alive a bit baffling, because even if a fetus is indeed a life form, and even if we accept that both infants and fetuses, if that's the plural, are forms of life, it doesn't mean that we have to bite the bullet of accepting infanticide when indeed we accept or defend abortion. And secondarily, just because it is alive does not mean it is sacrosanct. We often accept limitations to the right to life, or limitations to entities' right to life, if they're strong and countervailing considerations. So I realized abortion wasn't on the list of things I want to talk about, but I hope this segue was helpful in illuminating different strategies in approaching the abortion debate, which, for the love of God, I just don't think there's much point in debating, even though technically there's a lot of interesting moral philosophy surrounding the issue. I don't think this is a very interesting debate motion for various reasons. I can talk about those reasons for another day. Anyhow, where were we? We were talking about the idea of the three-tiered model of rights and also justifying rights, etc., and a criteria for rights. So yeah, I hope that effectively, has encapsulated what there is to know from an introductory point of view concerning animal rights, and also why animals may or may not have rights in that sense. The final thought I'll leave you on in this section is about the environment. That is to say, what about the environment? Do we think the environment has much value in its existence, and can such value be decoupled or uncoupled from animal rights at large? Now, let's set aside the anthropocentric reasons as to why we might care for the environment. Yeah, there's also an interview actually that Peter Singer's done with us, so you can check that out online, but I'm not going to plug my publication because I think that's really rude. Anyway, moving on. So on the environment. Now, you might say that the environment is worth caring for because obviously destroying the environment causes global warming and damages our own interests and is bad for human beings. And then there might also be the claim that damaging the environment hurts the habitats or hurts animals by destroying the habitats and impairing their abilities to reproduce and also hampering the welfare, blah, blah, blah. But I would also posit that there's a plausibly radical view, but an interesting view nevertheless, that the environment is intrinsically valuable in its own right. And here's how. When you look at a work of art, say Mona Lisa, and someone comes over and trashes it, they burn Mona Lisa, you'd be pretty angry. You'd be pretty angry not necessarily because, oh my God, Mona Lisa's destruction means that other people would be sad because they can't see Mona Lisa anymore. No. You feel angry because you think Mona Lisa, as a work of art, deserves appreciation, deserves preservation. It's beautiful. And the destruction of what is aesthetically pleasing and aesthetically, pretty, or whatever you call it, aesthetically virtuous rather, or meritorious, is in itself a wrong. So some folks have analogized nature to works of art beyond just rhetoric. They say it is a work of art, it possesses aesthetic value, and the sabotaging of such aesthetic value is intrinsically unjust. Now, just a few quick thoughts about this aesthetics-based argument. But before that, let me drink some water, because, aha, pun intended, it is in my nature to drink water. So firstly, this argument concerning aesthetics seems to assume that nature, at its best, is aesthetically pleasant. But which part of animals, or lions killing sheep, and monkeys consuming, what do monkeys eat? Whatever. Shellfish, maybe. Which part of this is aesthetically pleasant? I don't know, but it seems to me that a lot of nature, especially nature when non-interfered with, is actually pretty cruel. So you might say, but you're just imposing human lenses and judging nature. Maybe nature at its core is still very much beautiful if you don't look at it through human lenses. But realistically, how can we look at something without human lenses? I'm a human being, you're a human being. We can't just say, imagine being a non-human and therefore look at them through non-human lenses. Unless we're somehow aliens or something, we can't look at things without gazing through them through human lenses. So therefore, I think that rejoinder doesn't quite stand. So that might be one reason for us to quibble with this aesthetic-centered claim. Another reason for us to be uneasy, though, is do we really care for aesthetic value for its own sake? Or is aesthetic value only important because it instrumentally makes us feel good? When we talk about the aesthetic pleasantness of nature, what we're really saying there is, I think it looks really pretty. I love looking at nature, and it is something that adds my positive utility. But that might also be reason for us to think that at the end of the day, this is all anthropocentric. That besides human being, in a world without human beings, to look at nature, the so-called aesthetic value of nature really doesn't exist and doesn't really matter. And still, a third reason to be skeptical is, what if destroying the environment or partially destroying the environment leads to it looking prettier or actually enhances its aesthetic value, right? So all of these are reasons for us to think that there might not be indeed an aesthetics-based claim for our duty to not damage nature. So an alternative strategy might be to say that it's about future generations. And this is where I want to talk very quickly about future generations in lieu or in light of everything we've said about non-identity problem and also rights and also nature and animal rights. Why exactly do we think future generations have at all possess rights, and especially rights over us? Why do we think so? Or do we actually think so? Do folks think that future generations have rights, or do we think that they don't have rights? Any thoughts? Okay, never mind, I'll keep talking. So, some folks might say that future generations do not have rights because they don't exist. And just as Iago from Othello doesn't possess rights, or the unicorn from La La Land, or a unicorn from a unicorn La La Land doesn't possess rights, that's also why future generations don't possess rights. But if we grant that fundamentally, future generations do not have rights, then concurrently, it seems a lot of our chat about preventing climate change, preventing resource depletion, preventing damages to the environment, then falls flat. Not just for the reasons that we highlighted under non-identity problem, because the very demographics that we're trying to save there do not have rights. So some people might say, oh, but they still are important because they have interests, right? And these interests give rise to like pastoral or sort of transitory duties or prudential duties. But clearly, and then some others at least insist that clearly something's amiss here. There must be something more than just interests at stake here. So how then are we to understand future generations' rights and the rights of future generations, if at all? Well, some folks posit that you can interpret future generations' rights through hypothetical claim making, or the fact that they can exist as hypothetical claim makers. That what we're really saying here when we say future generations have rights is that they can issue and hold claims over us currently, and when they become actual, when they are born, or when they come into existence through conception, technically, that is when they acquire those rights. So rights are acquired, but claims are presently instantiated. But it still doesn't deal with the objection that future generations do not exist, right? Because there might be good reason to think that, if Iago comes into existence, he can therefore, claim these rights. But why exactly should Iago have any sway or claim over us now, given that he's purely imaginary? That's a very good question. So when we want to understand why future generations have rights, we probably want to do a bit more work there. Unless, of course, we just bite the bullet concerning interest theory of rights. But even then, right? Whose interests are we talking about? These people don't exist. What's the difference between me saying, that the person born in 500 years' time has these rights versus Iago has these rights, right? Under the interest theory of rights, it seems neither of them, you can't discriminate one from the other, right? Because both of them are non-existent. So you ask, Aniket, that's why you value the next generation more than 10 generations in the future. Well, I don't know, right? It's because, at the end of the day, the next generation is yet to be born. So under the claim, or under the framework we talked about just then, Iago, the Czech born in 500 years' time, the Czech born in 2 years' time, and the Czech born tomorrow, they all have the same moral status, So that seems a tad implausible. So a suggestion that I've recommended, and I personally think could be employed as a solution to this problem, is just to bite the bullet and say all of these individuals exist. The future person in 10 generations' time, the future person tomorrow, the imaginary person, the hypothetical person, they all exist. So long as they interact with this timeline that we live in at some point or another. So if Iago never comes into existence, like say Iago's never existed in the past, of course, but Iago is also not going to come into existence, supposedly, until the end of time. If that's indeed the case, then Iago does not have rights. But so long as you exist on this timeline, this actual timeline of the universe that we're in, even if you are yet to be born, you still exist. So that's my personal view, and that's my answer to this challenge. And that's a lot of my ongoing research concerning moral eternalism and how you can devise a theory of eternalist rights, or rather an eternalist conception of time, and how you link that to understanding transgenerational relations. Anyway, I digress. But the gist of this discussion is to say future generations' rights are not something that's set in stone. It's not something that's guaranteed. There are good reasons to be skeptical of them, just as you might be skeptical of whether animals have rights, or Iago has rights, or the environment has rights. But if we think about future generations' rights and the prudential duties we might develop from that, we might then say, look, I don't know why we ought to care for the environment intrinsically. I probably don't think there's any intrinsic value there, but we ought not damage the environment, because doing so would jeopardize the interests and also the welfare of our future generations, many, many generations in the future. Ergo, destruction of the environment is morally impermissible and wrong. And that, I think, is perhaps a useful way of concluding the section concerning animal rights and also environmental rights at large. So for the final 4 minutes of our lecture today, and I realize I've droned on for a bit, so I'm so sorry about this. I want to talk a bit about, I can't talk about Kant. I can't talk about Kant. The reason why I can't do so is because it's going to take up too much time. So I can answer the question on criminal justice system. So here's the question that I got. I'm going to read it out, and then I'm going to paste it over actually in the Zoom chat. So give me a sec. Okay. So someone's asked me, how do you argue against and in favor of punishing people for crimes they committed on accident? Why should intentions, or why should they not be the only factor that you consider? So let's start with a case against punishing people that they commit on accident. So I appreciate that that was in brackets, not negligence. So I presume the reason why that was inserted is so as to prevent me in saying that there are background duties and reasons to expect them to have complied with those prerogatives, and therefore you hold them accountable for failing to fulfill what they're supposed to do. So well done on that preemptive question. That basically frames out a possible and easy answer. A less easy answer then is what I call a moral luck argument. So Carl Knight and also Michael Otsuka have both written on this, and it's quite interesting. It's also a research area of mine. But anyway, the responses are say you should not punish individuals for actions that they did not intend to or foresee at any point, and should not be liable for, therefore, in a morally charged sense, or should not be morally responsible for. You should not hold them accountable. You should not punish them, because it is purely a matter of bad luck that they have committed these wrongs. Just as you would want to compensate individuals that lose out on something as a result of luck. So for instance, someone that happens to be born in a disaster-prone area and therefore is hit by an earthquake and tsunami one after another, or someone that just so happens to be born into a terrible household that is abusive towards them, these folks deserve compensation. And in the very same manner, the very individuals that by bad luck have ended up becoming culprits and perpetrators of these wrong acts don't deserve punishment, because they themselves are not responsible. And if anything, luck is responsible for causing their moral misery. Ergo, you should not punish these people, given that they are going back to what I said just then about straws and responsibility, exempt from responsibility, or rather excused from responsibility. Sorry, not exempt, but excused from responsibility. And B, it is also just sheerly a matter of bad luck that have landed themselves in that particular position of being the culprit, because had the gunshot that they fired missed the target, they would not have been a murderer. But because the wind blew and blew and blew, the bullet therefore hit the target and ergo caused the target's death. This is Thomas Nagel's example, by the way. then the fact that they are a murderer is a product of bad luck. That's a potential reason for which we should not punish them, because we ought to compensate for the disparity and disadvantages imposed by bad luck. And the moral disadvantage here is one that we can only rectify, or we should rectify, by not prosecuting or pushing the charges forward as such. The rejoinder against that, though, is exactly what I said just then under the section about moral responsibility, that we should consider intentions, but that's not the only thing that matters. That independent or setting aside intentions, we should also, A, recognize that there are certain background responsibilities and duties that we hold people against. So if you're a teacher, you have a duty to teach well, to not overlook your duty towards your students. And to the extent that you do, even if you have no such intention to cause such harm to your students, you ought to be liable, or you ought to be held responsible because you're not excused from that failure to deliver. Or alternatively, even if you are hypothetically excused, there's still other reasons to think that you violated background duties. But suppose that, again, we set aside cases of negligence then, and why we should still punish these people. Well, I think then we can bring in what we call forward-looking considerations concerning the consequences of punishment, whether it be in terms of deterrence, in terms of rehabilitative power of punishment, in terms of protecting society at large, in terms of establishing a norm that people can adhere to. All of these are forward-looking instrumental reasons for punishment, and they do not depend upon, at any point in time, desert or claims of desert, that these individuals deserve to be punished. So I think that's how you can defend your argument, where indeed there's no negligence, there's no failure of background duties, and there's no backward-looking reason for which you can hold someone responsible. Even then, there are reasons based on good consequences, long-term consequences, and a general societal good that can motivate and justify punishing people. So I hope that hopefully answers your question. If not, feel free to PM me on Facebook to ask me more questions. With that said, I hope the past 2 hours have been fruitful. I really enjoyed this lecture because it constituted me talking or ranting, and also Aniket contributing. So I very much appreciate that. But either way, thank you all for your time, and thank you all for listening to me. If you have any further questions, please get in touch with me. Thank you all very, very much. Cheers. Bye. Bye. Thank you.